What I want to do to start things is rather than doing what I typically do on a Sunday morning, just sort of open up a passage and going verse by verse through that. What I want to do is sort of, what I'm going to do instead is work from, here are 7 misconceptions that many people have about money. And what I want to do is take these misconceptions and sort of deconstruct them from a biblical view and then reconstruct actually a more biblical framework for these things. And so let me start with this first misconception by laying out 2 scenarios, and I want to see if you can tell me what you think the misconception, the underlying misconception is beneath these 2 scenarios. Here's the first scenario. If you were to ask an average high schooler what they want to do for a job, for their lifelong career, typically this career decision would revolve around a job that makes good money so you can get a good house, get the nice car, take the nice vacations, and have a lifestyle that you want rather than choosing a career that's fulfilling. Scenario number 1. Scenario number 2, a college graduate, so somebody who's already invested time and money in pursuing a degree, they make a series of lateral and incrementally better moves from company to company within the same field. Tracking with me here? They get a job, that's cool. Company A, company B comes along, they've got a little bit better job in the same field. Now the work is enjoyable and there's little to complain about with each company and how they treat their employees. But with each move from company to company, there's a slightly bigger paycheck, or at least the allure of an opportunity for more earnings or even a better position. Eventually, this person feels like they've hit a ceiling, which is still pretty high ceiling as their upper middle class. They feel like they've hit a ceiling. They're making far above the average income, and the only way for them to get to the next tier is going back to school or switching to an entirely new field, which would either entail accumulating more debt and taking more time out of the workforce. Now, what do you think? What's the commonality between these 2 scenarios here, the underlying motivations for what would compel someone to do these things? What do you think? More money. Yeah, paying bills. But what about it? So what does money specifically, having more money, what do you think the promise of more money is? Yeah. Yeah, totally. You guys are nailing it. This first misconception about money is that more money will make me happy. It's easy. And I think it's something that no matter who you ask, it's just sort of like this low simmering belief that people have, no matter how many finance seminars you've been to or how your mindset has been shaped from a biblical perspective, right? There's always the cultural pull is more money is going to make me more happy. A study that was published in 2018 shows that once we exceed a certain household income, there is an association with a reduced life satisfaction and a lower level of well-being that sets in. There's a certain number. Anybody want to take a guess at what that number is? 75,000, okay. 100? Anybody else? 50? 30,000 more than I have. That's the right answer. No, they say, that, and this is the average for the United States, and I think that in the Midwest it would reflect a lower number, but they say that number is 105,000. Shared income. So if you've got 2 families working and you got a decent job, or two, mom and dad working, dual income, right? More than likely, you'll be hitting that threshold. Yet there's still people who are wanting that $200,000 paycheck, wanting that more, right? Because behind this idea is that, more money will make me more happy. But at 105, their satisfaction doesn't increase. Yeah, once you get past that, it starts to go down because then here you are trying to keep up. Like this is part of the cat and mouse game. Is like you get a little. It's like I want a little bit more. And so you got to keep up with the Joneses. They take that vacation. I want to take a vacation like that, or even better, right? They get this car. So there's just continual chase of trying to keep up with that. So here, this study shows that actually more money won't make you happy, and if you get over that threshold, that it'll actually start to make you less happy. In fact, that's one of the reasons why suicide rates among the most wealthy people in the world are so high. It's like there is this general disposition of unhappiness that once they reach that upper echelon, that makes them unhappy. Now, if you're at a place where you're making more than $105,000 a year, you don't need to feel guilty about it. But there is this sense of, your joy, your happiness is sort of in a volatile position. There's this temptation to kind of keep up, to keep going. And so your joy could easily get snatched away that if you get sort of swept up in this more money. And so this seminar, if this is you, is designed to help you make sure that your money, that money doesn't rob you of your joy. In fact, one of the things that Jesus says that Paul echoes in Acts chapter 20, he says that it's more blessed to give than to receive. So there's a sense that if God has blessed you with a good income, that he's positioned you to get even more blessing by giving what you have, right? And so that's one of the really neat invitations the Lord makes to us. Now, for those of us who are like, man, my income is a long way away from 105. So that, it's like, I can still long for that. I can still want for that. But there's something to be said about, having this comfortability with having a stable job, security with your job, a good source of income. And there's going to be some people in this room that the seminar is going to be like, hey, maybe a wake-up call that either my lifestyle needs to change so that I start living more within my means, or maybe this is God sort of inviting me to pursue a different kind of career that can bring some sort of stability. So not only do I have that inner peace as far as financially goes, but I'm positioned to bless other people as well. But here's the thing that Paul talks about. The more that we long for money, Jesus talks about this too, the more that we long for money, the more that we're likely to turn it into an idol and begin to worship it. And so if you're sitting at that $50,000 mark right now, it's like you're looking at the $100,000 mark. The more you long for that, the more your heart's going to be gravitating toward it in worship. And so you're going to start to put things on the altar and start sacrificing to the God of money in order to get to that goal. And so whether that's relationships, your time, your physical health, there's all kinds of sacrifices that you might make in the chase of these things. And it's not just money itself that we make an idol. So it's not like, I like to have a $100 bill in my pocket at all times. It's really, and we kind of picked up on it earlier, it's the things that money offers us. The safety, the security, like the stability, the comfort that we might get from having this. And the more that we do this and turn money into an idol, not just money itself, but what money offers, the more we displace God from that number one spot in our hearts. And so instead of going to God, which he invites us to come to him for our daily bread, right? The Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. Instead of going to him, we start going to our boss, right? Instead of him, we start looking at what we've done this week and the hours that we've logged in so that we can get that money. Now, this is one way that God provides for us through our skill set and our ability to work and receive pay. But when that thing becomes the number one thing, we start pushing God out. Instead of looking to God as our refuge and our provider, right? Jehovah Jireh, we start looking to ourselves and what we do and the jobs that we hold. Instead of looking to God for our sense of status and our identity, we look to our paychecks, our bank accounts, to say, well, this number has ascribed a dollar amount for how much I'm worth, instead of me going to my identity in Christ, that God has told me that I'm infinitely worthy because Jesus laid down his own life for me. And so those are the things that we push away from when we start chasing the God of money. Now, can money make you happier? I think that, yeah, maybe. There are things that money can provide that would be, at least momentarily, provide some sense of joy, but also maybe not. But Paul says in Philippians, he says he's found the secret to contentment. And he talks about, I've learned in whatever situation that I am in to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound in any circumstance. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Paul here shows us, for the Christian, there's this opportunity for us to be content regardless. If we feel like we're on a shoestring budget or we're in a season of abundance, that there's this ability for us in Christ to be content. And he says that in Christ, that in him, I can do all things. That's not necessarily just meant for athletes, you see it tattooed on their face or whatever. on a game day. It's like, this is like, hey, this is how Christians make it through the world, that I can do all things, that I can trust that Jesus is going to provide for every one of my needs that I have as I make it through here in this world. And so in times of little, God provides, the church steps up, we see little miracles in between. In fact, I'm going to go long, I know this already, but in a season of beginning ministry, my wife and I had basically quit my job at the car dealership, jumped in to go on staff I had to raise support, basically hadn't raised very much support yet. So that I could pursue this. It was really silly. This is not an advocation for quitting your job. Maybe have some things lined up. This is not the responsible. Matt's going to be the one who tells you how to be responsible. I'm the irresponsible one. My wife was still in school. We did not have any income really coming in. I was trying to raise support. And in that time where we just really faced, a deficit, where we just didn't have much, God provided in a lot of ways through our church family. We were blessed a lot. In fact, as we were raising support, a lot of people stepped up from within the church family to help meet our needs. Just seeing God, our cars lasted longer. Like, we probably should have had a ton of car work that happened. We were both driving kind of junkers. In fact, eventually, this is crazy. So we made it through, oh gosh, I don't have time for this. Basically, long story short, Becca's dad before we were married, Becca's dad took care of all of our car stuff. So oil changes. I had assumed responsibility for my own car. I was not yet ready to assume responsibility for her car. And so in that time, this is probably 2 years, I don't know if her car got an oil change, people. Well, maybe one. It was not a regular thing that we did. It wasn't on my radar yet. What changed that was when we took it into the shop and realized that we needed a new engine because it did not have. But through God's providence, I had been brought on staff. Like, we had been given a very generous gift from a family member who passed away. And so just continuing seeing how God has provided for us through all those seasons. Yeah, our bad decisions, our negligence. But God, He makes concessions for our irresponsibility sometimes. So in times of little, God provides. We get to see that. In fact, that's kind of a sweet spot to see, just even within our missional community. A couple weeks ago, somebody brought up a big need that they had with their vehicle and said, hey, it looks like we got to put this on our credit card. Our MC rallied together and said, hey, we want to bless you. And so here it is. They're in a time of just a tight budget, and to be a blessing to them and step in. And we've done that multiple times. I know other missional communities do that. And then there's times of plenty where the invitation stands for us to, as we're blessed, to be a blessing, right? We lean into that. It's more blessed to give than to receive. And so ultimately find our contentedness that comes in Jesus, not more money, right? That's no matter where you're at, the offer for contentment stands right now in Jesus, and He is the ultimate source of our joy and happiness. So that's the first misconception, and that's the longest one that I have. Now, the second one I want to talk about is this, like, when we talk about, I think there's two types of people. There's people who just gravitate towards money and say, I just want more of it. And then there's people that say, I don't want anything to do with money. I just don't like the conversation. I don't like to think about it. I don't like to look at my bank account. I don't like to plan. I don't like it. So there's this mentality that money is bad. Money is an evil thing. And so it's like kind of the opposite of what we talked about before. And so people say, well, I wish I didn't have it. I wish I didn't have to deal with it. In a perfect world, we wouldn't have to. And they're kind of right. In a perfect world, we wouldn't have to deal with money. And they even point to some passages like 1 Timothy chapter 6, where Paul says the love of money is the root of all evil. And they kind of chop it up a little bit and say, well, money is the root of all evil. Well, actually, that's not the case. It says the love of money is the root of all evil. And so I think a more helpful way, a biblical way to look at money is this. Money is morally neutral in and of itself. Think of it like magic, all right, for you Harry Potter fans. Money is like magic in the sense that it has a power. It can open doors. But magic can be used for good things and it can be used for bad things. How you use it will determine if it's good or if it's bad, if it's good or if it's evil. And so money has this ability that it's in its moral neutralness to be used in either good or bad. And our relationship with money, how we use money, is going to determine if it's a good thing or a bad thing, if it's something that's used to serve ourselves or if it's used to serve God. Ultimately, that's what it boils down to. If you're using money to serve yourself, ultimately, then it's dark magic. If you're using it to serve God, then this is good Harry Potter kind of caliber magic. But here's a helpful thing. So in thinking about this, in this sort of moral neutrality of money, money follows the same storyline as the creation, the gospel story. So if you've been at Sacred City, we talk about creation, fall, redemption, restoration. God created the world. Fall, sin entered the world. It went broken. A lot of things went wrong. Redemption through Christ. all things are being put back together how they ought to be, and then one day in the new heavens, new earth, everything will be perfect, that there will be no blemishes, no anything wrong with anything. There's just complete joy forever for eternity. Well, money kind of follows the same storyline in the sense that, first of all, money is created. In the Garden of Eden, money didn't exist. Like, Adam and Eve have everything that they needed at their disposal. There was no need for currency or exchange. And I don't know what it looked like, if Eden would have continued on and a civilization would have, maybe at some point. But we see in the Garden of Eden, there was just plenty. There was an abundance of resources for them. And then sin came along, and actually Adam's work, which was the tent of ground, gets hard, and now there becomes this sort of commerce that has to happen. There's brokenness of money. The love of money starts setting in instead of the love of God, the love of money, which perpetuates evil, which you could argue is why Cain killed his brother, right? The love of his wealth, his resources, kept him from giving a right offering to God, something that's from the heart. And then he got jealous of Abel and killed him, So you can see that the love of money, or money, took this twisted bent, and here in Christ we see that money has this new power. It can be actually used for good. It's not just this bad thing, not something that we throw off as Christians and say, hey, we don't deal with money, but how Jesus is redeeming money. And of course, this comes back to our relationship, using God's money ultimately for us to understand that the money that we have is not our money, but it's God's money that's on loan to us, and we're using this money for God's purposes and His glory, not our own. And so that's what our redeemed mentality of money, and when we place when we place ourselves under the lordship of Jesus, our money will follow, right? We don't get to compartmentalize our lives and say, well, I'll give Jesus my time, and I'll do family devotions at the table, but when it comes to my checkbook, Jesus doesn't get a say in it. No. The lordship of Jesus is over everything. All things are for Him and to Him. And so that also means that our money is meant to serve Him, and it'll be under His lordship. And so as this happens, here's the crazy part about this. That as Jesus sort of takes the role of Lord of our money, of our wallets, it's a way that He actually captures our hearts. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, He says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be. So there's actually this ability for us. When we put our money in the right spots, our hearts grow to the right things. And so there's this power that Jesus uses in redeeming the use of money to actually get to things on a heart level for us. So that's the number two. Number three, as we get into this conversation, the misconception is, yes? Misconception number two is money is bad. Yeah. Misconception number three, budgets are too restrictive. Now we're going to talk about budgeting a lot, and we're like, what we're doing is we're designating money to go a certain place before the money goes somewhere else, right? We're telling our money what to do before it tells us where it went. And so there's a lot of times when we get into this, it's like, oh man, that kind of takes out if you're a spontaneous person, sort of takes out the spontaneity of things. It restricts me from doing the stuff that I really want to do. And so there is this sense where it can be restrictive. So it's like you go to Home Goods and you see this cool rug. It's like, can I get it? Does the budget say I can get it? Nope. Okay, well, I probably shouldn't get it. Or, can I go eat at Cafe Fresh for the third time this week? Is it in the budget? Nope. Probably shouldn't do it. I ate there last night. Can I get a new tattoo? Can I get a new AR-15? Can I get a new car? Is it in the budget? Nope. Well, probably shouldn't do it. Can I get that bourbon I've been wanting? Is it in the budget? Does groceries count? It's a grocery item. That's my logic. So yeah, there is this sense where budgeting is restrictive, right? Because we're saying, this is what it's designated for, and if it's not this, then I'm not going to spend it. So yes, but this is a matter of stewardship, like figuring out ahead of time what is the best use of my money. And so we're doing a little bit of front-end work, figuring out, again, once this is God's money, how do I use this in a wise way? Because we're all going to have to give an account to God for how we use our money. Actually, we're all going to have to give an account to God for how we used His money. And so we want to take this stuff into consideration. Now, honestly, a budget is just a theoretical thing. You can make a budget and forget about it tomorrow. Like, you can sit here and we can plan it all out, and it's going to work out on paper, and it's going to be primo, and then tomorrow it's like, nah, I don't want to, it's too much work. I really want that AR-15. And so we can take this theoretical thing, but here the beauty of budgeting is taking this theoretical thing and making it a practical thing, making it something that we actually exercise self-control in order to do it. Now, what we're doing is we're limiting ourselves in the short term in order to open up for ourselves something in the longer term. So think of it just kind of like, this is what as I was talking about this, or jotting these ideas down, think of it as Jesus was talking about the narrow gate. Enter the narrow gate. It's going to be hard, he says, but it's going to open up to life. This is kind of like the parallel. Budgeting could be an illustration for what Jesus is talking about, the narrow way. It's like budgeting, we're choosing this hard way, this restrictive way. We're limiting our immediate spending. It's going to be hard. There's going to be sacrifices that we have to make to keep things in check, but it's going to open us up in the long run. So when it comes time to buy a house, comes time to buy a car, when we got to start investing in our kids' education, or you want to go back to school, or you want to make some sort of big life decision that requires a lot of capital, you are positioned in a place that you can actually do that. So in the long run, I love, like, Jocko Willink is a guy that just is great at this stuff, talking about, like, self-control, self-discipline. It feels restricting in the moment, but actually it opens you up to freedom in the long run. It's like lifting weights, right? I'm going to limit myself by, I'm going to keep myself self-disciplined to lift weights so I get stronger and stronger over time. So if the need were ever to come for me to pick up my kid or pick up my car, I can pick up my kid, but pick up a car off my kid, I have that ability. I have that freedom, that power to do so. Budgeting is the same thing, right? It allows us to get through the narrow gate to enter into financial freedom. So yes, it's restricting, but ultimately it's liberating. Number 4, I think. This one comes down to I started talking about how do we determine if we have reached a position of financial health. I think if you were to ask anybody off the street, how do you know if somebody's in a good financial spot? I think the common response would be, you're out of debt. Or at least you just have the good kinds of debt, which Matt will kind of clarify bad debt, good debt later on. That's kind of like the bar, the standard, right? Are you out of debt in a way where it's not bombarded with credit card debt or whatever the other kinds of unnecessary debt that would be? Now, there's a lot to be said about living within your means, which is why we're talking about budgeting. And Scripture warns us about putting ourselves in debt to other people, right? It's a vulnerable position to be in. Proverbs 22:7 says, the borrower is slave to the lender. And so there is a sense that if we're borrowing money, especially for not good reasons, we put ourselves in a vulnerable situation, not just in the immediate, but the long term. Which is why credit card debt can be so brutal. They get you while you're down, and they just keep getting you, and they don't stop. It's relentless. But simply being debt-free doesn't mean that you've reached a position of financial health. There's a lot of ways. This is number 4. Yeah, debt-free does not equal financial mastery. Or I guess if you said it, the inverse would be the misconception. There's a lot of ways to have an unhealthy relationship with your money. First of all, you can be money obsessed, right? You're just focused on accumulating more and more money. If that's you probably don't have a lot of debt. But chances are you're probably either stingy, you're not generous with your money, very, very frugal, you don't actively pursue ways to bless other people, or you just like to spend money, right? You have money, and so it's like, well, of course I can go spend it on whatever I want. And so there's this unnecessary spending, a lack of generosity, and specifically Jesus condemns the Pharisees for they're generous in sort of an appearance sort of way, but not like a sacrificial giving sort of way, where you see this lady who throws in 2 little copper pennies into the altar or into the offering tray, and he says that lady gave more to everybody else in the room, right? Because she gave from a sacrificial position. So there's a lot of ways to have an unhealthy relationship with money, but here's the way that you actually find money mastery, is that if you let Jesus become your master first. You can't have financial mastery. This is why Jesus says that you can only have one master. It's either going to be Jesus, it's either going to be God, or it's going to be money. Those are basically the 2 big competitors when it comes to who you're going to worship. And so the only way to master money is to get out from underneath the thumb of money, is for you to put yourself under the lordship of Jesus and allow him to have his way and listen to the wisdom that God lays out through the Scriptures, and also means of common grace, so that we can have a healthier relationship with money, where there's this balance of spending on the necessities, of living within my means, living a lifestyle. Now, the call of a Christian isn't into abject poverty, right? Like, there's something to be said about God putting all kinds of different people into different places within our city to reach people, right? So, like, if you're an upper middle class person, like, you don't need to go live in the slums, right? You can have this sort of average lifestyle of somebody that's in that tax bracket and be where you are with intentionality to reach people for Jesus, right? That is something that we can say. So, but figuring out how to live within my means, what's a lifestyle that's going to reflect and honor Jesus, bring my spending into balance, be more generous than I think that I can afford to be, and do a good job of saving. So, in a telltale way you can tell if someone has mastered their money really comes down to the bottom line of are they joyfully and sacrificially giving? I think because that's like the last marble to fall, right? Is that if you're doing that, then that is a marker that you're probably moving towards financial health. And the reason that we can say that is we look at Jesus. He emptied himself for us. He bankrupted heaven on our account so that we could be brought in and share in his riches, in the inheritance in the new heavens, new earth. And Jesus said it was for the joy that was set before him that he did this, that he endured the cross for us. So bringing it here on the home stretch, the last three, these will go faster. Number 5, generosity is financially irresponsible. I've heard this said before as we go through membership meetings. Part of being a member at Sacred City Church is making a covenant, and part of that covenant is to commit to tithing, a biblical tithe. So a biblical tithe, this is the standard, the baseline of generosity. This is where generosity begins, is a 10%. Tithe is connected to 10%. So 10% of your gross income, not your net income, not after Uncle Sam has already picked through and got what he wants, but the first fruits, which you see, with Cain and Abel, right? God was concerned with Cain's offering because it wasn't his first fruits. It wasn't his best. It wasn't the first thing coming off the harvest line. Where God said the first fruits, the 10%, the top, the cream of the crop, give it to God. That's where generosity begins. Now, some people hear this, say, well, that's 10%'s a lot. And in some ways, like if you're new to tithing, yeah, it kind of is a lot. Comparatively to Uncle Sam, he takes 30%. So, I mean, like Uncle Sam, Jesus, And so there is this, because it is cutting into the lifestyle, right? This is the beginning of like a sacrificial gift back towards God and offering to God. And so there are some ways where this is a big deal, where you can feel the pinch of this. And in many cases, for some people, like 10% is just the beginning, where it's like, hey, this is the baseline, and then maybe this year I want to give 12%, and so they can see this growth and generosity, kind of like what I was talking about before. But for people who are just starting, they push back on this commitment because, well, it's a lot of money. We're talking about 10% of my gross income. Like, how am I going to pay for my kids' braces? How am I going to pay for my kids' school? How am I going to pay for my medical bill? So and this thing's like, if I do this, then I can't do these other things. Financially, I'm going to be left at the whim of Uncle Sam or my missional community or whoever is going to pick up the pieces. Well, that might be the case for a season where you really feel that pinch, where there's not that overlap of, the abundance of resources. But one of the things that Jesus wants to bring in check is what might be irresponsible is your lifestyle that you're living. If you're living beyond your means, like if you're living beyond what God has allocated for you, what God has gifted you, and he says, hey, I've given you 100% of what you have, and all I want back is 10%, as sort of a sign of trust and dependence. If we're not taking God up on his offer to care for us, then we're the ones who have entered into this financial irresponsibility by living beyond our means. And so there's an invitation for us to live in a responsible way, to live within our means, where we can still, do the things that we like to do, but to do them in a way that's financially responsible. And really the bottom line is that if you put your money here on earth, it's going to rust, it's going to decay, it's going to get stolen. If you invest eternally, it lasts forever, and it multiplies. And so the most responsible thing that you can do with your money is to invest eternally. Number 6, God doesn't need my money, so why should I give it to him? Right? See, the psalmist says that the cattle on the hills all belong to God. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Everything belongs to God. Why is God pinching pennies for this 10%? Right? God doesn't need it. Why do I give it? Well, actually, tithing is less about meeting God's needs and realizing your own needs. Because money, again, can be subversive, and where it steps in and it plays the role of God. I can give you comfort, I can give you security, I can give you blessing, I can give you what you want, instead of going to God and finding these things that God himself wants to give to us from himself. And so God doesn't need your money. God doesn't need your money. But in a sense, you need to know that you need God. And so by taking away some of this money, that extra 10% or wherever your generosity marker is, that opens up this need that, man, God's got to really make the gaps close here. And so in this sense, you can't afford to not give. You can't afford to not be generous. Because the blessing that Jesus is inviting us into is far better than having some cushion in our bank account. God doesn't need your money, but you need to give it. It's for you more than it is for God. And the other part of that is that God is inviting you into what he's doing. So Christians aren't spectators up in the grandstand that watch God work. Like, God actually calls us out of the stands and says, hey, first of all, I want you to be a missionary. I want you to be, you are a minister of reconciliation. You have an agenda for the gospel, but actually I want to deploy your resources to the same end. So God calls us into that as well, and so we get to participate in what God is doing through generosity. And the final one, I hear this all the time. The church just wants my money. Like, this whole finance seminar is a ploy for the church to get more money. And it's like, well, from an organizational perspective, yeah, the church relies on people giving, right? If nobody's giving, we can't heat this place. I don't get a salary. We don't get to do the mission stuff that we're doing. We don't get to support church plants. So from an organizational perspective, yes, but from the mission of God perspective, and this eschatological community called the church, so the community that's not just going to exist here on earth, but carry on into the new heavens, new earth, that church doesn't need any money. That church carries on regardless of what sort of cash flow there is. God's mission is not frustrated by a lack of resources, but what we get to step into is deploying our resources to aid the advance of God's mission. God doesn't need our money. The church doesn't need the money. But the church becomes so much more effective at reaching people, about blessing people, of supporting, of becoming a beacon of light in a city, where, yeah, the money is helpful to do those things, but we don't need it. And ultimately, in Jesus, and talking about money as much as he does, and in fact, money is the number 2 thing that Jesus talks about in his ministry. First, he talks about the kingdom of heaven, and second, he talks about money, treasure, number 2 thing. And the reason that he does is because he realizes that our hearts are divided between God and money. And he's calling us to abandon our hope in money and things and possessions and align them more to God himself. And so Jesus doesn't want your money, he wants your heart. Bottom line, right? Where your treasure is, there your heart will be. He's trying to pull your heart. And so those are some of the misconceptions, the 7 misconceptions that I have about money. Hopefully provide a little bit of clarity from a biblical perspective about how we handle money, or just even reframing the concept of money, which will kind of lead us into the more practical stuff here. We're going to take a little break here, take 5-10 minutes, and we'll start going with the budgeting stuff with Matt.